Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody on the phone, and thank you for joining the Bramasol webinar series. Today we are focusing on the leasing topic, and we'll be talking about ASC 842 leasing disclosures, more than compliance, insights to action. We'll be taking and connecting the dots between leasing disclosures and analytics dashboards to provide insights to action for customers. Carrie, next step. So we are going to go through our normal housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar, so feel free to download it, go to our website and do that. We'll show you how to do that. Ask questions throughout the seminar. You can see down here, hopefully, that there is a questions panel. We get a lot of questions, so feel free to go ahead and ask those questions. As you ask questions, we'll be able to respond, obviously, to most of the questions that say, can you do something? As to how do you do them, sometimes those questions are a little bit tailored, so we'll try and answer the ones we can. And if you have a specialized question, we'll take those offline. You can download the previous webinars. That's fine, Carrie. Go ahead. Perfect timing. Download the previous webinars from our webpage. You can go up to the webpage home site and go up to the top and click our resource center. You'll find all of our previous webinars there, as well as a whole series of ebooks and videos that can help you better understand both the ASC 842 and the 606 topics. In addition, you can go down to the bottom of the page and link there. Also, feel free to contact us. We have a contact us on our website. Join us on LinkedIn and Facebook. So with that, we'll move on. Today, as I said, we'll be talking about ASC 842, and we're excited to be presenting some of our new dashboards and disclosures. Some of you have seen them at Sapphire. We're going to be talking a little bit more about those and building them out and showing you the concepts of drill down, drill through, drill back kind of activities. So take a look at that. We'll be joined by Julio Della Costa, who is on my team. And Julio is the Director of Technical Accounting and comes to us from the role as a controller in a large organization. And we'll be adding sort of that flavor of, for those of you for accounting. And then my friend and colleague also, Carrie Peterson, Senior Solution Engineer, will be walking us through the solution and taking a look at how we can do that. So we'll start with the Bramasol vision, move on to disclosure reporting requirements. We'll do some lease data extraction, talk about disclosure reports and dashboards, and wrap that up. Next slide. So what is the Bramasol vision? Bramasol is the leader in SAP finance, compliance, and transformation. We do this through three pillars. Number one, leasing. As the experts with dozens of projects in place and focused on leasing and co-innovation with SAP, we're really the go-to partner for both, for all leasing topics as they relate to ASC 842, IFRS, and asset management. And we do a lot of co-innovation activity with the SAP Labs team. On the far right, we are the undisputed leaders, if you will, in SAP revenue accounting. Having done more projects pretty much than anybody else, well over 50, 60 projects under our belt with revenue recognition, and are, again, the co-innovation leaders. And then focus in on finance transformation. So really turning action into insights, really looking at how does the office of the CFO move from record to report and reporting from today backwards to really leadership in the organization and providing the insights that lead to differentiation. How we do this is through deep analytics and dashboards, insight to action, really, as my CEO, Dave Fellers, would say, really using analytics and dashboards as the face of finance transformation, helping people really look at how do things change, what's driving the organization, and using those analytics to connect back into the what's happening in your organization and driving change and action forward. And we do this on what we like to say, and we've heard, the SAP Finance Innovation Platform that is SAP S for HANA. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the disclosure requirements, and for that I will turn it over to my colleague Julio Della Costa. Julio?
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. So, as far as 842 and IFRS 16 goes, all companies, public companies, are rushing towards the deadline for December 31st, 2018. Private companies will be rushing for one more year advanced. From disclosure perspective, there are basically two ideas that we talk about. On the left side of the screen, you talk about what is the operational information that I need to manage my lease portfolio more efficiently, more effectively. If you look on the left side, it says operational reports, management reports. What does that look like in real world scenarios? From the open leases perspective, the first question everybody would ask is, where are all my leases? How am I tracking my lease cost? How am I looking at my lease portfolio? The next thing you want to think about is modifications. How am I thinking about my modifications? Do we know what modifications we're going through? From the management perspective, the internal borrowing rate is very important because that's going to drive your present value calculations, as well as looking at what is my return on invested capital? Is it more efficient if I buy my assets rather than lease? That's on the operational side of the fence for lease accounting. On the right side of the screen, we have what are our mandatory reports. As we know, ASC 842, IFRS 16 is coming into play, which means that for public companies and private companies, we now have to include a new financial footnote. The capitalization of leases will go on the balance sheet. There's going to be a cash flow impact, as well as we're going to have to describe to our readers of our financial statements, what does our lease portfolio look like? What are the qualitative pieces of our portfolio? What's the interest rate we're using? How does that differentiate from my incremental borrowing rate? These are some key potential pieces that as we go through compliance and companies are projecting out their projects now, we're going to have to be able to answer. And I think I am very excited today because what Carrie is about to show us will manage both sides of those needs from a CFO controller company perspective. Next slide, Carrie. So from a disclosure perspective, I wanted to talk about what are the financial impacts as far as looking at, we have a new accounting standard coming into play at the end of the year for public companies. Again, private companies will be 1 year later. But what does that look like from an accounting perspective? In the boxes below, you would see there's 5 basic impacts. The first impact is on the balance sheet. Companies would now have to take what is the future payments, present value those back to today's time as of 1/1/19 for public companies, and they're going to have to capitalize their operating leases. Contrast that to under 840, the previous standard in US GAAP, where basically it was an entry. It was debit, lease expense, credit, cash. So it's a big fundamental change for companies. There's no more off-balance sheet financing. All leases, finance and operating, will go on the balance sheet. So from that perspective, you're going to have a right of use asset on your left side of your balance sheet. On the right side of your balance sheet, you're going to have a lease liability, which would correspond to what are the future payments in today's value. So I'm present valuing back the lease liability for future payments to today's value. Unlike the right of use asset, which is a long-term asset, the liability side has to be broken out between short-term and long-term. So you're going to have your 12 months liabilities as well as your past 12-month liabilities. The next big impact would be your income statement. So for operating leases, you're going to actually show your lease expense. Finance leases, as we know, goes into interest and depreciation. Another requirement that you're going to have to show will be short-term leases, which is leases less than 12 months, as well as your variable lease expense. All these are very new requirements that are required under the new accounting standard. From your cash flow perspective, we will have to disclose what are the operating cash flows from both your finance and operating leases, as well as your financing cash flows from your finance leases. So that's going to be new line items in your cash flow. from the weighted average calculation, this is not just an extract. This is actually companies are required to calculate the remaining lease term for both operating and finance leases, as well as what is the IBR, which is incremental borrowing rate for your lease portfolio. Again, these are going to be calculations, not just data extracts. So there's a lot more work involved in understanding what is the weighted average calculation for both my discount rates as well as my remaining lease term. Lastly, as a requirement, we have the maturity analysis. This looks very familiar to our current 840 accounting, which is essentially you look at your undiscounted cash flows on an annual basis for the 5-year outlook. Companies usually put this in their current 10Ks under the commitments and contingencies footnote. So this would be very similar to what you see in today's 840, which was a new standard coming into 842. So it's a kind of a carryover from the old standard. Next slide. Before we actually get into the demo of our new product, I wanted to talk about some key considerations. Key considerations in that right now, Bramasol, we have over a dozen lease accounting project implementations going on all over the country. And here are some of the top 4 questions that we get in all of our projects. And to give you some more insight onto, what are some of the questions our customers are asking us, and some insight into some of the answers, which is more important to people like yourself on the call today. So the first topic is the incremental borrowing rate, as we call it, the IBR. So as we know, under 842, the guidance is quite specific in saying that you have to use the rate implicit within the lease contract. Well, as we know, most contracts, most lessees would not have the rate implicit in the contract. So therefore, there's an expedient that you can use. What is your incremental borrowing rate? The number one question we get on every single project is, Bramasol, where do we start? How do I come and assess what is a typical incremental borrowing rate that we should use? Well, to answer that question and to give you some more insight, the guidance is quite clear. The first thing is incremental borrowing rate has to be bifurcated based on the economic environment. What does that mean? That means that you can't use the same incremental borrowing rate in China or Argentina as you can in the US. The second piece of the incremental borrowing rate is the lease term. You have to use specific lease terms based on the life of the asset. So obviously you will have a different IBR for a 30-year lease, like a building, versus a 3-year office machine. The last piece of IBR is you have to differentiate your IBRs based on asset class. What does that mean? That means that essentially you're going to have an expected different IBR for a building lease, different from an office copy machine lease. So those are some of the key considerations for IBR. And the next question we get is, well, where do we start? Most companies in our projects, what we see them doing is they actually get information from what is your latest debt financing rate. So most companies, even though the guidance says you can't use the company's cost of capital, most companies start with that. What is your borrowing rate that you did your less debt finance deal on? And then you bifurcate from there based on lease term, asset class, and region. What are the nuance for 842 that was new for 842, different from 840? The reason why most companies cannot use their weighted cost of capital, as we call it in accounting, the WACC, is because it now has to be collateralized debt. So when you think about IBRs, what you're thinking about is actually, if I go to the bank and I get a loan, what is the collateralized rate that I'm going to get? Obviously, the collateralized rate would be a lesser rate than if it was a risk-free rate or uncollateralized rate. So those are some of the considerations that we talk about as we go through our projects that we see now. The next consideration, what customers ask us in our projects is, What is the best idea? Should we bifurcate lease and non-lease components, or should we combine? The reason customers ask us that is because there's a practical expedient in the guidance that says you are actually allowed to combine your lease and non-lease components. So the question we get all the time is, should we actually combine them, and why? What's the pros and cons? First of all, let me take a step back and explain to the audience what is a lease and what is a non-lease component. Take a building for example. There's a base rent, which is the lease component, and then there might be a CAM or maintenance that you're paying, or utilities. These are considered non-lease components. So the practical expedient under 842 allows you to combine the base rent plus the utilities plus the maintenance to have that as your beginning balance to present value. Why does that make a difference? It makes a difference because if you don't decide to take the practical expedient, the guidance tells you that you have to now bifurcate based on standalone selling price. For all you 606 revenue recognition folks out there, you would remember that the 606 guidance also brings into what we call standalone selling price. A lot of companies have had issues with actually understanding what does it mean to bifurcate based along the standalone selling price. So for most companies that we see in our projects, they have decided to take the practical expedient and make it easier on the accounting folks to combine their lease and non-lease components. The only caveat with that is, what does that mean? That means that when you capitalize on 1119, you're going to have a larger right of use asset and corresponding lease liability. Why is that? Because your starting point for your payments, in addition to base rent, you're also adding in the non-lease components, which is the maintenance, the utilities, the stuff that doesn't relate to your base rent payments. Those are some of the questions that we get for the lease and non-lease components. The other topic that we get a lot of questions on are short-term leases. The guidance clearly explains a short-term lease is a lease that is 12 months or less. So what does that mean on an evergreen lease? An evergreen lease is a lease that continually renews itself. Most companies have many evergreen leases where it's 12 months and they've been renewing for the last 12 months. So then do we have a 12-month lease or do we have a 5-year lease? In practice, what we tell our customers is you have to go to your historical renewal rate. What does that look like? If I have a 12-month lease on paper, but I've been renewing for the past 5 years, probably we don't have a 12-month lease. We actually have a 5-year lease. So that is some of the nuances on why you would want to take a closer look at your 12-month lease, because the question you will have from your auditors is, okay, do you really have a 12-month lease, or is this more of a 10-year lease? That's some of the nuances for short-term leases. The last consideration that we get a lot of questions on our projects right now is, what is the lease term at inception? Why is that important? 842, the new guidance, says that you have to estimate your total lease term at inception. As we know from lease accounting, many leases, you have a base term, so maybe you have a 12-year term, but then there's 2 renewal periods. 842 guidance says that you have to estimate whether the likelihood of you taking those 2 renewal periods on day 1. So do I have a 12-year lease or do I have a 30-year lease? You have to use what we call in accounting reasonable assurance. That is about a 70 to 75% surety of you think that the company's best guess estimate is that they're going to take the renewal options or not. Contrast that to, you have a 12-year lease term and you have a termination provision at the end of 6. So the question comes, do you have a 12-year lease or do you have a 6-year lease? If the company believes with reasonable assurance that they're going to terminate after 6 years, then our argument is you have a 6-year lease, even though your paper says you have a 12-year lease. Very important as we go through the projects. Next slide.
Hey, Julio, real quick,
Yes, sir.
just to say, so the importance of all of these and having these accurate also says that you want to make sure that you have a solution that can support all of these elements, but also links back into your core financial systems, right?
Of course, John. So all these four key components that we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes is essential because these things will drive your lease accounting project, and it drives on paper your technical accounting analyses, but it also drives your configuration of the software that you decide to choose to actually go on that journey. So yes, John, very important. These are going to impact every lease accounting project all over.
I'm also struck by the concept or the issue here around things like data abstraction and data quality, and getting these numbers right and having a good extraction process is crucial, right?
Yes, John. So we always advise all our customers, and most of our customers have already started their journey, but lease abstraction actually is at least 3 to 4 months of the part of the project before you even get the software selection. Because the lease abstraction process is not just abstracting the data, it's reviewing your data,
Right.
cleansing your data, cleaning your data before you upload into the software. Because as we know, garbage in, garbage out. So you want to make sure that your abstraction project also includes data validation, data cleansing. So by the time we get into the software, we can be reasonably assured that the data is as clean as possible.
Right. Cool. All right. Thank you.
Yes. So this is a pretty neat slide in the sense that, so Bramasol, as we know, we're focusing on two main solutions at this point. We have SAP CLM and we have the Nakisa solution, where we're doing projects on both. From the perspective we talked about a little earlier, there's the compliance with the law, compliance with the SEC requirements, US GAAP, IFRS 16, ASC 842. Come 1/1/19, companies will start reporting after the first quarter closes in March 31st on their 10Qs about how they adopted 842, how they adopted IFRS 16 for public companies. As we talked about a little bit, we're going to have all the impacts on your income statement, your balance sheet, your cash flow. If you're using the modified retrospective, you're going to have a modified adjustment to your retained earnings. And then you're going to have this brand new financial footnote called lease accounting. And you're going to have all the qualitative aspects of it, telling the reader about the portfolio you have, the policy elections you made. We just talked about short-term leases, variable lease expense, and all the good stuff like that. And then we're going to talk about the maturity analysis. But then on the flip side, we have the managerial reports that we in Bramasol are about to show you. And this is where I get really excited, because what I think we're about to show you is something that's going to be very, very transformative for a lot of companies. Next slide. Carrie, I think this is to you.
Right, no pressure there, Julio. All right,
Can I tell
so
you,
good
I get
morning.
excited about this stuff.
So good morning, good afternoon, and probably good evening as well. So correct, so as Julio just mentioned, so much effort is put into the lease data extraction in order to get that data clean so that when you do run your reports and the analytics that you're going to see, then the information is correct. So whether it's Nakisa, lease administration, that you've gone in and you've extracted the information from your leases, and then they are providing the raw data and the disclosure reports from that solution, and if you're using SAP CLM, so again, you've gone into your leases, you've done your terms and conditions, you've extracted that information, the renewals, everything, every item that you have to consider, as Julio reviewed, that information has been entered in CLM, and then CLM has calculated the disclosure information, and what you're looking at here is at a contract level. So that's imperative. Now, once that data has been extracted, it's entered into your system of choice, or multiple systems for some companies, and then at that point, where we have taken over is, taking that information from whatever the source may be, and in some cases using SAP extractors. If you're on ECC, if you're on S4, then there are standard integrations and views in order to pull that information out in order to create the reports and the dashboards that you're going to see in a few minutes. Okay. All right, so let's just get right into the solution itself. The first thing I'm going to cover is an actual disclosure report generated from SAP, and then getting into the Bramasol disclosures. This is a Bramasol report, again, using the data that's been extracted, that's in CLM, and then the views and queries that we've created to pull that information in for the report.
So Carrie, I just wanted to interject a little bit here. So what you're looking at on the screen, actually, if you have all the quantitative requirements on the left side of the screen, which is lease cost, short-term, variable, all the stuff we just discussed, then you'll be in compliance with 842 and IFRS 16.
Thank you. Right, and on the right-hand side, this is John's going to be talking about our roadmap. The report on the right, the maturity analysis, is almost completed, and probably the next webinar I'll be showing that one. But again, John's going to be talking about the roadmap at the end of the webinar. So let's go into CLM. Last time, for those of you, if you're on the webinar, I timed out, so I decided this time I was just going to log in each time. All right. So to run the report that you saw in the PowerPoint, okay, I have set up variant. So I am just pulling a range of contracts. I'm doing this both for ASC 842 finance and operating leases. I want to do a comparison of 2020 and 2019. There are going to be, you'll have other reports that there'll be different filters, for instance, year to date, quarterly, asset class and such. So this one, we're just choosing these as our filters, and we'll go ahead and execute the report. We've had customers that have said, okay, I want a one-point solution where I just click, or a one-click solution where I can just click and the system will just generate my disclosure requirement report. And basically that is what I am showing you here. I just did a preview, and then I want to be able to enlarge that for you for the webinar so you can see. Let me just do a little bit larger, and then I'll just drag through. So we'll just start with the first part of the report, that the lease cost is looking at the costs that are actually that are part of the requirement, as far as it does not include the short-term lease amount. That is included in the total lease cost down below. But you're looking at the comparison between 2019 and 20. Again, the short-term lease is falling off and it's not included in the 2020 numbers. And then again, we talked about the financial, so you need to report on the financial as well as operating leases. And we'll just go ahead and scroll through down further. And Julio, please jump in at any point.
Yeah. So what I was going to say, Carrie, on the top there, you have all your income statement impacts. So we talked a little bit about it before, but this is essentially your lease cost that's going to appear on your income statement. So you're going to have that 17.9 million and 19.8 million. Those are going to show up on your profit and loss statement. And then we're going to show the breakout here. So the breakout is a requirement of 842. So this is what your financial footnote is actually going to look like. So beyond the quantitative piece, where we're going to describe our lease portfolio, talk about the policy elections that the company has made, this right here on your screen is going to be what your footnote looks like, and it is in compliance with 842 and IFRS 16. The next piece, what you see down there, is the mid piece, which is the cash flow impact. So as you can see, if you have any gains and losses, if you had a sale or lease back, it would show up on that line item. And then the next set of items are your cash flow impact, which is what was my operating cash flows from my finance leases? What was my operating cash flows from my operating leases? And we talked about what was my financing cash flows from my finance leases. That is your finance impact for your cash flows. And then the next two lines are really if you had any exchanges from ROUs in exchange for finance leases from operating side, and then if you had any ROU assets obtained in exchange for operating lease liabilities. If you had those, for this demo, there was none because we're doing a demo, but in a real life environment, you would actually, that would be populated from the extract from SAP. And then the last three items, what we talked about, are the complex calculations, which are the weighted average calculations. So really what you see there in the first two is you have the weighted average calculation for finance and operating leases, which is the remaining lease term. That's going to be very important because what it does, what the calculation does, is required to do, is you take your total population and then you take a weighted average of the remaining lease term. The last two are really the discount rates, what we call the incremental borrowing rates. What are the incremental borrowing rates from my finance lease portfolio? What are the incremental borrowing rates from my operating lease portfolio? What the calculation is doing is that it is taking the weighted average discount rate and bifurcating based on finance leases and operating leases. And it's doing, again, the whole weighting. So it takes your total portfolio and then weights it by the different types of leases. Carrie?
All right,
Hey,
thank you.
if I might, let me make a quick point there, because we talked about an extract from SAP, and of course we're using SAP CLM as the, our ability to do the drill through, drill back, et cetera. But I want to make a point here that the way we're building the tool and the way it's been set up, the idea is we don't really care what your source is. So whether it's an SAP solution like CLM, an SAP solution like SLAN or Nakisa's NLA, or even a third-party solution should you choose to go down that route, the tool will work the same. We're extracting data, putting it into somewhere that you can then pull it, and using our tools and our information to provide and develop these reports for you. So I want to make sure that everybody understands it's not just a SAP thing, it's an SAP thing, but it's a way that you can extract data and use this tool almost regardless of the solution you choose.
Great, thanks, John. Okay, so as we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, it's beyond, beyond the requirements, getting into, now I'm going to show you the dashboards, as well as, like Julio said, you're going to have to be able to explain your portfolio. So a picture tells 1,000 words. So we'll take a look at the dashboards, and then that you've put in the effort of doing the extraction, you've got your disclosure reports, but let's see how that information can help you make better business decisions in the future. So with that, I am going to go ahead and log into our dashboards. Give me 1 minute.
So while Carrie is getting set up, I just wanted to interject a point here. So we've just seen the SEC required disclosures for US GAAP, IFRS 16, 842. So in a perfect world, a company would have just done its compliance reports, but we want to show more. We want to do more with those compliance reports. So we have the compliance reports already set. We've pulled our extracts. We've inputted them into our SEC documents. We filed our 10Q. We filed our 10K. But now we're in a CFO meeting, and the CFO wants to go one level further. He wants to start analyzing his lease portfolio, or the CAO of the company, or the controller, or the executive team. So on one side, we've done compliance. Now this is where we get into the operational side of it, where we're actually managing our portfolio, looking for ways to increase our efficiencies, looking for ways to increase the effectiveness of our management style within the portfolio, looking for ways whether we can lease or buy, looking for more in-depth insight into, we've complied, now let's see how we can transform the portfolio by looking at analyses. Carrie?
Great, thank you, Julio. And just to go back, if you remember when I ran the report, I just did it for a range of contracts. Where here we're pulling in additional contracts into the dashboard, so the numbers are going to be, they're going to look a little bit different here. But what you're looking at, so we have our total right of use assets. This is a global view. So we have the US, we have the UK, and we have Singapore. We are also seeing all of our asset classes. So we have buildings, equipment, fixtures, and fittings, and vehicles. We're seeing the average effective interest rate for, again, this is a global view of all asset classes, the average lease expense, and then the total liability. So this is a great view of, again, your 360, again, all regions, all asset classes. This is a percentage on the pie. This is showing as far as the percentage of assets, so 85% of the US, then we have the Singapore, and then Great Britain. Now, if I select Singapore, I'm just gonna select a piece of the pie here. What I wanna show you is that based on this information and some additional information in the other dashboards, is that there are only, I'm gonna change this, but they're really, if I go ahead and just select the equipment, you're gonna see that all 4 of the assets that are for Singapore are gonna be equipment. And the reason for that is that the interest rate, I'll just give this a minute to build here, is that for Singapore, let's go ahead and select Singapore again here for equipment, is that there's 4 assets out there, leases for equipment in Singapore, and the average interest rate in Singapore is at 9.62. So that is, standard if you're going to look across the, the world here as far as interest rates or the cost of doing business. Singapore is very high. So there are no buildings or vehicles that we're leasing for this company scenario. Because of the high interest rate, then the companies decided to purchase all the buildings that they have in Singapore. So again, letting the information kind of drive, Leo mentioned earlier, lease versus buy decisions. Also, if I'm just going to do a jump out here from the average lease expense. To a different dashboard that is now showing again for all countries, multiple years, what is the average lease expense for the different asset classes. Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense if I'm just looking at fixtures and fittings that they would have a higher lease expense than equipment and buildings. So once again, this is kind of bringing my eye to maybe a possible error, issue, a mistake that the dashboards are going to help you with. So if I go back to, I'll just go back to our overview. Let me just go right over. So if I go back to our overview dashboard, and now I select fixtures and fittings, I'm going to get a little bit different view into what the true picture is there with that asset class. And what it's going to show me is that there's actually only one asset out there, and the average lease expense is $100,000. So it's going to be good to have views on not only into the average lease expenses, but actual lease expenses, because even though you do have to report on average lease expense, what we're going to do is go into and just see what the actuals are in just a minute. Okay. So from this, though, let's say this is, I got one asset out there. It doesn't make sense that it's 100,000. So I'm going to, again, that was lease expense, so that the interest rate would impact that as well. So I'm going to come over to now take a look and just say, well, was it our interest that might have been impacting that particular asset? And no. So the interest, and by the way, Julio and John, how is my time? Is my response good?
Yeah, it's not too bad. It's pretty good.
All right. So I was able to go ahead and select then fixtures and fittings. So I'm going through and discovering, based on the information provided in the dashboards, do I have a scenario where Before we said lease versus buy, or in this case, I have fixtures that one contract that's saying that my average lease expense is, or month really is 100,000. So my interest rate's correct. And then from here, what's nice, and John mentioned this, is then I could go ahead and jump into the contract itself and investigate the contract to see if there was an error, and maybe that should have been 10,000 or 1,000 instead of 100,000. I am going to do a drill through with interest rates later on in the demo.
So Carrie, I just wanted to interject a very good point here. So in my previous experience as a controller, I would go to these executive meetings and a question would come up. And that question, I would have to take a note and actually say, I'm going to get back to you. And I would have my team do the research, and the next meeting we would give the answer. This capability really allows us to put this up on a screen and real time answer any questions that a CFO and executive will have on our lease portfolio. So that's why I tell you I get really excited when I see this, because I have seen the pain of taking a note, spending 2 or 3 days doing the research, and then coming back, oh, okay, we had a miskeyed lease in Singapore. Instead of 10,000, we keyed it in as 100,000. This solution and the answer is right here in front of us by you clicking 2 or 3 buttons. So that actually helps, the company run more efficiently, run faster, make faster decisions. So this is very, very powerful, what you're showing on the screen here.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah, Carrie, and Julio and I talked about, and I think just real quick is, the other thing is, as you're seeing what Carrie's presenting out of S4HANA, the beauty also is not only are we saving days and weeks of time, we're allowing people to have meaningful conversations real time, but we're also avoiding the, hey, Julio, why don't you go back and pull that data, and looking at it and say, well, I pulled it from Tuesday and he pulled it from Thursday. They don't match. Because you're pulling this data real time out of S4HANA, you're getting real data, real time. You're avoiding the he said, she said conversations, and you're all looking at the same data at the same time. So I think that's another great part of what we're showing here.
right. And then I also wanted to add that, there's no two companies alike. So once you've got the data cleansed, once we've done the extraction or pulled the views, then, this is just one view of how dashboards can look and act. Obviously, that's part of sitting down and looking at companies and saying, okay, how do you need to see, your data as well? So I want you to keep that in mind. A couple more examples here. So on the total liability closing balance. So again, this is looking at total view, but I want to go ahead and jump to another dashboard on that and look at the closing balances by liability. So here was March 2019. I can do some comparisons with different months, but now I'm seeing that those asset classes broken down again on the closing liabilities. So one, I want to look at so that's the liability itself, but what's driving that liability is the lease expense. So now I've selected the current lease expense dashboard, and this is giving me now a trend. So similar to the report that John's going to talk about as far as our roadmap, it's one of the requirements of being able to see a 5-year trend out there for liability. This is looking at the 5-year trend of your lease expense. And along with that, on the right-hand side, so before we were talking about the contracts and the leases, so now we are actually able to look at the assets themselves. So if I'm going to select Great Britain, and it's going to bring up the contracts that are specific to Great Britain. In just a minute. And then while that's growing, what the intent is then I'm going to be able to do a comparison and see which assets dropped off or were added over a period, whether it was a month or a quarter. So again, giving you additional insight as to, we'll just give this a second, insight as to, again, so I saw that my expense went up over a month or it dropped from a month, and what specific contracts or assets caused that change, whether it was the liability or the expense. So it looks like we are having a little bit of technical difficulties here. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my next. Okay, I'm gonna just refresh this page. I just did an F5 there. And all right, live demos, gotta love them. All right, it's not refreshing for me either. Let me see if I can. Just try something else here. John, it might make sense if I can't get back in.
Yeah.
I'll spend one more minute on this. I'm gonna see if I can log back in and continue on. If not, I'm gonna probably have to hand it over to you.
Okay.
But let's see if it'll let me log back in. And see, I can't blame it on a full moon. I think that was last week.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe there's something going on in Sedona, right?
Oh, perhaps.
So while Carrie's logging in, folks, I think there's a couple of really great points, and Julio made those. But again, think about the dashboards and the tools and the questions that you're asking, and being able to bring down the timelines that you have for getting this information. So things like, you can reduce by a week decisions that the CFO might make on financing. And a week, when you have a small amount like this, is one thing, but when you're financing hundreds of thousands, millions, a week can make a lot of difference in terms of interest rate decisions, borrowing decisions, et cetera. So, dashboards like this will certainly be extremely helpful. And as we look at this, and Carrie continues, the question becomes, Bramasol, how did you do this? How did you pick what you wanted to focus on? And we'll talk about that. So are we good, Carrie?
We're good. I'm just going to go do time. I'm going to jump to the drill through to get into another scenario where we're able to look at the interest rates by contract. We have color coding for exceptions here with anything over 6% to highlight in red. This 10% is standing out to us, so we're going to go ahead and go into the contract itself and see if that was indeed an error. And there we go. So let's take a look at the contract. And I'm going to point out that these are Fiori. This is not a Fiori app per se. It's Fiori-like. If we were using a Fiori application itself, then that filter would pass through. In this case, it is taking us right into SAP, but I do have to put in the filter with how this is built here. So I'm going into our contract. If I go to the conditions, then and then the valuation parameters, I do see that it is in there as 10%, but I have a memo here that it was supposed to be 1%. It's an incentive for future contracts. So that was indeed an error. I'm going to go ahead and change that to 1%. Go ahead and save my entry there. This is simplistic for a demo. If I was going back and actually reevaluating at a point in time, then I would choose a new behavior here as far as how to treat that. But for demo purposes, just change it to 1. And now if I go back into my, let me just exit this.
So Carrie, as you run that, I was just looking at your analysis and I was thinking internal audit departments would really love to get a hold of this tool because you can review, you can assess, you can see if there's any errors, any mistakes. So not just from a finance perspective, but I think a lot of auditors, especially internal auditors in organizations, would love to get their hands on this tool so they can do their analytical reviews, as well as probably even external auditors as they do their analytical reviews for the quarters and for the year ends, where you can really do real-time analysis and you can have answers coming back to you in real time rather than pulling the data, sorting in Excel, looking at it, coming up with the results, where this took about, what, 5 minutes? So I think that is the power of this tool, really looking at data in a number of different ways, in any way you actually want to. I think that's the power of this tool, yes.
It is. And thank you, Julio. I just came back after fumbling around a little bit there, okay? Came back into my dashboard. I'm doing a refresh. And again, you're going to see the live update of the 10% being corrected to the 1%. And once this is done, then I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, John, to wrap up.
Great, thank you, Carrie.
And it might have to do with something here in Sedona, you know. You never know. The vortex is interfering. So for you, I do live in Sedona, Arizona, for all of you out there that look it up. It's beautiful. All right.
There it comes.
It's coming. Anticipation.
Yeah, so as we talk about this, you know, the power of this is linking back to those contracts, being able to do what we call drill down, drill through, and drill back, and that's drilling back into the application or drilling back into the core data, whether it comes from, you know, here we're able to dive right in, but you can drill back to the data, look at the contracts, and then use tools to go back into applications, for example, like Nakisa, because you now have the information that says, oh, what's that contract? You link over and see, oh, there's the specific issues and challenges, and we can fix that problem. So it's a great opportunity for doing all of that.
Yeah,
We're still cranking through here.
We're still cranking through. I'll tell you what, I'm gonna bring the PowerPoints back up, okay? And
all right.
We can come back at the end. All right. All right, John.
All right, thank you, Carrie. So, you know, let's talk about where these tools come from. So we've heard about Julio talking about the requirements in the 5 different areas. We've talked a bit about what the tools are and what they produce from a reporting perspective. Let's talk a little bit about the roadmap itself. Like what we've done, and I encourage you to go back and take a look at if you've done ASC 606, looking at our disclosure reports, and we have an app on the partner portal for SAP. You can buy that app, download it, take a look at it. But here we're taking that same approach, which is to be agnostic, if you will. Really beginning this structure or looking at things like ABAP. So in a solution like CLM or partnering with Nakisa, creating extractors and tools that allow you to pull out the information that's required. How did we decide what this information was? Well, number one, we looked at the regulations. So people like Julio, who's a CPA and has been doing this for years, combed through it, and we looked at all of those key disclosure requirements and developed a data map and developed the definitions and the tools required. And then we looked at what are the formulae and what are the various tools to create a database, if you will. So we created methodologies and tools to extract it. We use ABAP here, that's the SAP word, but working again with Nakisa to extract them. The next step is to create a BW environment. A lot of our customers come to us and say, well, you know, I don't really just need ABAP, I need a place to manage this and use all of that data. And so we're working on and have created a BW environment in which you can look at all of these and you create different structures with that. And then finally, as you look at the dashboard itself, it's rendered and produced using the SAP Analytics Cloud, which is a super powerful tool that allows you to do a lot of different activities, different views, different cuts and slices of the data in SAP and really begin to do real-time analytics. And the beauty is in SAP Analytics Cloud, when you use solutions like this, you can link back and drill back into the solution. So our roadmap for the moment is to continue to go down, and we'll continue to build these out. We mentioned that there are two, I think, next slide, Carrie. Do we have a next slide? Yeah, so we talked about the maturity analysis. This is on the quote-unquote roadmap. It is actually in production. We are testing it. We are building it. So this tool, both of these that are required by FASB are available to you, and we have it available so you can look at things like multi-currencies. You can look at both the FASB and the IASB examples. So if you need to do it in either, those are in the roadmap. Future roadmaps will focus on not the data per se, because the data is the data. As my friend Julio would point out, accounting is accounting is accounting. Whether it's a piece of real estate or a movable asset, the accounting is basically the same. The question becomes scenarios. And what we're working on and continue to develop is those scenarios and testing those scenarios. We did this. There's over, we've heard as many as millions of different kinds of lease scenarios. There's probably at least hundreds of thousands of lease scenarios. Because we've worked on this for a number of years, because we've worked on a number of SAP projects, we have a sense of what the top 20 or so scenarios are, and we're building our tool set to get you started with those 20 or so scenarios. So in a nutshell, roadmap says we're building extractors that you can use. We've created BW environments, and using the SAP Analytics Cloud, you can see that we've created both a combination of dashboards and drill back and drill through tools that you can use. So, I think that, Julio was very excited about this. I'm very excited. I think that we get a lot of questions every day from people asking us about, what do I do about disclosure reporting? Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about. So take a look at this. Feel free to ask us any questions. We're here to support you. I want to thank Carrie and Julio for their support, as well as the SAP team who has helped support this process. And I thank everybody. We'll be following up and having this up on the website, so feel free to download it and share it. And I thank everybody for your participation, and have a terrific day.